What kind of impact is Dean Evason going to have on this team? That's one of many things that we're talking to Jef Svoboda, Jackets Insider, about today on Locked On Blue Jackets.
You're Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms, over on YouTube and on SiriusXM. I also have to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Now, today, we've got a special bonus episode for you, a Saturday episode of Locked On Blue Jackets. It's the second part to my conversation with Jackets Insider himself, Jef Svoboda. We had a really great conversation that went a little bit long for a regular episode. So, hey, here's part two. We're talking a little bit about Dean Evason. We're talking about the Monsters. We're talking about all kinds of things, really. But I'll just get into my conversation with Jef because, let's be honest, that's what you're all here for. So take it away, past me. Yeah, the Jack Johnson signing I thought was really interesting because it's kind of something that I've been asking the team to do for a minute here, and it's something they haven't really had since Scott Harrington left the team, which is a guy that is capable of and happy to kind of sit in the press box, be a seventh defenseman, but if he's needed, can jump in the lineup and not be a complete liability defensively, which is sometimes that's all you can ask for in a depth defenseman, you know. And so I see a lot of people kind of complaining about the Jack Johnson signing, but I am all for it. And kind of as to the younger defenseman, the theme of Locked On Blue Jackets this offseason has been temper your expectations, because I know I do it as well. The idea of getting these guys and throwing them in the lineup. We're doing this like the same thing with Gavin Brindley as well, who likely won't be hurt by spending some time in the AHL. Overdevelopment of defensemen, I don't think is a thing. Yeah. And so, you know, putting them back in the AHL is not going to stifle their development. I think it's just going to turn into a case of, will their development be helped more by playing through NHL mistakes or dominating in the AHL for another year? Because you look at what David Jiricek did in the AHL as an 18-year-old, it's hard to then be like, okay, do we leave him in the AHL to dominate, or do we just let him kind of play through the development, the kind of the quote-unquote ugly development stage of being a young defenseman in the NHL? It's a tough decision to make.
Yeah, and you know, I've heard coaches say there's no such thing as a guy who spent too much time in the AHL, and I know fans want to see these guys at the NHL level and playing big minutes and things like that, but it's a process, and it was for Adam Fantilli last year. And I know there was a million tweets sent about, Adam Fantilli only playing this many minutes a night, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's 19 years old, and you're going up against, Austin Matthews's and Steven Stamkos's and of the world, and, any top centers, Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid and things like that. There's going to be a learning curve there. So, you want to put them in those situations, but you also don't want them to be beaten down by those situations. So there's kind of a happy medium there to hit. But you're right. You can't really overdevelop guys. The more experiences they get, and you don't want to necessarily have to rush them. Look at the history of the franchises. You could argue there's probably been some players over the years that were rushed, and did that help their development or did that hinder their development? So, and these guys and the guys we're talking about too are still so young. I mean, Fantilli is going to be 20 this year. Jiricek's 20, I think, until November. I'm pretty sure Matejchuk also 20 years old. So it's a hard league for a 20-year-old to really, gain their footing and feel like they're not being overwhelmed at times. Especially when you're playing guys that have been in the league for 10, 15 years, and guys that have that extra 10, 15 years of not just experience, but muscle, man bodies, guys that have been in the gym in the off season for, since these kids were 3 years old, what I mean? So, I know why, and I'm the same way. I'm a fan of teams, and you want to see the young players come in and be given the reign and be given the chance and those things like that. But you also have to be a little bit careful at times of, making sure you're putting them in the right situations to go through that development as well. So, I'm not trying to poo-poo anybody for not wanting to, I'd love to see Adam Fantilli for 20 minutes a night, but is it the best thing for him at times? Maybe not. He had some games where he played really well against some of the top centers in the league, and he had some games where, that line that he was on going up against a fellow opposing number one line really, struggled at times. So, you pick your spots and you kind of read where the player's at and things like that, and then kind of go through your development from there. But there are times where you'd rather see a guy develop too much than throw him to the wolves and see it kind of go wrong. So, you just kind of have to read it as it goes.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about the difference that coaching is going to make this season in a second. But before I get distracted, I want to ask you a little bit about Cole Sillinger, because he, to me, had such a great turnaround, bounce back season after a through not very much fault of his own. I think he had kind of a miserable sophomore season. Really struggled to stay in the lineup, struggled to stay on the score sheet. This past season, he kind of, I think, really came into his own as a young player in this league. And you talk about, Fantilli facing off against the number one lines. Well, that was what Cole Sillinger was doing at the end of the season. That you watch when Jenner was out injured, Fantilli was out injured, Sillinger was really carrying the heavy load there against, the McDavid line, the Crosby line, the McKinnon line, and kind of, again, holding his own. What did you see from Cole Sillinger this season that kind of has excited you about the way that his career path is going to go? Because I think a lot of fans were ready to write him off after his second season in the league, which, again, he was 19, 20 years old. So obviously we shouldn't be panicking or anything, but this season I think has really kind of brought a lot of people's expectations for Sillinger back up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, certainly. And there's no doubt he had a really nightmarish second season in the league. And that's where you talk about sometimes these young development curves and, player developing. He was 18 years old for a whole season in the NHL and did play very well as a rookie. Not a lot of pressure on him, things like that. And then probably has a sophomore slump that second year, which we see quite a bit in the league. And, and he ends up going back to Cleveland near the end of the season, but he played, a lot of games that year and really struggled at times. And, maybe that's a situation we talk about guys being, rushed too early or being put in situations where it's, a little bit out of their depth. Did that second season help him? Would he been more well-versed to go down and play more in Cleveland? Who knows? It's hard to say. But at the end of the day, too, he also did get through that and got to a point where, again, I think he did, as you said, played his best hockey as a Blue Jacket at the end of last season. And again, still 20 years old last year, which is kind of incredible to think about. So, I definitely, as you said, was playing against some of those top lines at the end of the year, looked like, was not out of place at all. I think he gets a lot of credit. As a defensive center, he really thinks the game very well. And it's funny, though, that he was a scorer in junior and was thought of as one of the guys having maybe the best shot in that draft and someone who they, was pegged as kind of an offensive guy and then comes in and, you realize pretty quickly he thinks the game well, certainly grew up in it with his dad. So, a rocky road, but that's, again, every 18, 19-year-old center is going to have some ups and downs in the league. And to his credit, I think he went about it the right way, really learned from it, really took to heart, how to get better. And now we're starting to see the results of that. So a guy that I think is going to play a lot of good hockey in this league. I mean, heck, he's probably going to play until he's going to play 17 years in this league, probably. It was born to do it, as they say. So, yeah, I think you have to be encouraged by the way he finished this past season. I'll be curious to see where he gets from an offensive standpoint over the years, because he's had the two, years he's had this in the NHL, where he's been on the score sheet. I think it was right around 30 some points, 15 goals. I think he's a guy that certainly has more offense in him. And when will that come? It will be kind of an interesting question mark. But now that he's got the experience, at some point, I think it's going to be there.
I've got more of my conversation with Jef coming up in just a second. Before we do that, though, I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. Playoffs have wound down, though. We've got fewer games. The sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But good news. FanDuel is going to let me keep the sports going whenever I want, and they're going to let you do the same thing. All we've got to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime we are in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head on over to FanDuel.com, start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball, and also us. the Locked On Podcast Network. Yeah, he feels like a guy that's got a surprise, like 30, 40 goal season in him in the next couple of seasons, which is always exciting. But again, it kind of really depends on where he falls in the lineup. Bringing Monahan in has probably dropped him down to kind of that third line center role, depending on how a bunch of things shake out. But I think the biggest difference for this team is going to be the coaching. And that's kind of been a big theme of the offseason is how much of this season was due to coaching and how much of it was due to just kind of not getting the job done, so to speak. And I hesitate to like criticize Vincent too much because he came in a real terrible situation, 4 days before training camp starts. Congratulations, you've got the job. No prep time, and it really felt like he was kind of playing catch up all season. So I don't blame him for how the Blue Jackets underachieved this season, because I think that there was a level of underachievement there this season. But having a guy like Evason come in who's experienced, who gets rave reviews from the players he coached in Minnesota, what kind of difference do you think having a guy like Evason is going to make for a team like Columbus, which hasn't really had a ton of structure necessarily in the past couple of seasons, especially on the coaching side?
Yeah, I think it's going to help immensely. And that's the reason why when Don Waddell was going through this process, he talked about how important experience was and how they wanted someone who had been there and done that before. And I think one thing I've learned over the last couple of years, just being up close with Brad Larson and Pascal Vincent over the past 3 seasons is, and I don't want this to come out as a major negative, but I think both of them learned, they were guys that had spent a long time in the game and they'd been head coaches at lower levels, and they've been longtime assistants in the NHL and have been around hockey for a long time. But I think you learn just how different that big chair is. When you're the guy at the NHL level that has to make the decisions and the buck stops with you, and you're not just coaching anymore. You're dealing with the media. You're doing the overall planning. It's not quite like college football. In college football, you get to be the head coach. You don't coach anymore. You're the CEO of the program. And your assistants are the ones that really do the coaching. I think there's a little bit of that still in the NHL where you're going from an assistant coach who's really probably in the granular coaching of things to the person that's kind of the CEO of everything. And it's different. It's just a completely different vibe, different scenario. You're presented with different things on a day-to-day basis. Your calendar's more full. You probably have to worry about things outside of hockey more than you actually have to worry about hockey at times. It's a big transition. And I think both of those guys, you could tell at times where, it was new to them, shall we say. And I think bringing in someone like a Dean Evason, who has been there before and has done it in Minnesota. And I asked him that even at his introductory press conference, how much did you learn from your time in Minnesota that, maybe you didn't know before that? And, he agreed. He was like, there's a lot of things that as I look back, I probably would have done differently. I may have done X, Y, or Z, or maybe it was something I did and I wouldn't do again. So, I think you learn a lot from that as time goes by. So, and he said, he's a better coach now than when he left Minnesota. And he was, if you look at the numbers, he was a pretty good coach in Minnesota, it seemed like. So I think his presence, is going to be important too. I mean, just being around him at the introductory press conference, you get a sense that he's a leader. You can see how people would want to follow him. He talked a lot about accountability and structure. Every coach talks about that, obviously. But with his experience and, just his leadership skills, I think he's going to have the ability to really implement that more than we've maybe seen the past couple of seasons. So I'm pretty excited to see where it goes, because I do think that experience part of it is something that is really going to help him and something that's going to be really important for the Blue Jackets organization.
Do you get a feeling that he's going to bring in some of his own guys for the assistant? Obviously, we've had Steve McCarthy's been there for, I believe, since the start of the Brad Larson tenure. So he's been there for 3 seasons, came up from the Monsters. And then obviously they brought Mark Recchi in mid-season. And I believe Jared Boll is an assistant coach as well now. Do you get the feeling that any of those guys are going to be replaced or kind of added to? Obviously, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but they've said that one of the assistant coaches isn't going to be back. So, what's your kind of feeling on who? Is he going to bring anyone in to kind of supplement the coaching staff?
I think so. I think I don't know who's available. I haven't looked up who his previous assistants were. Maybe I should have. Who's to say? But I do think when a coach comes in, he wants a certain trust level with the coaching staff and coaches that he's worked with before. And I'm sure he has guys that he's worked with that he would like to have involved here. I think it's going to end up being a mix. I think you'll see one or two maybe coaches brought in and one or two coaches kept, because I think there's also something to be said for having that institutional knowledge on your coaching staff and having people who've been around the last couple of years and know how things work and know, how a player reacts to certain things and how the team has reacted to certain things in the past and, can kind of guide, hey, if we do this, here's what's going to happen, or here's what I think will happen based off of, we maybe tried it before, or I know how this guy is going to handle, this, whatever we're asking them to do. So I think it's going to end up being a mix. I don't know what that mix is going to be, but I think that makes sense. You want the best of both worlds. You want people you've worked with and people you trust on your staff, but you also want some of that institutional knowledge. So how it all shakes out, we'll see. I know Mark, I don't know if he's ever worked with Mark Recchi or Coach Mark Recchi, but, Mark Recchi was a guy that is a Western, grew up in kind of the same area as him. Actually grew up watching Dean Evason play up in Kamloops. So, maybe there will be some kinship there. He coached Steve McCarthy at one point. So, maybe, there as well. I feel like Jared Boll's kind of an institution here, and I think he's really grown as a coach over the last couple of years. So maybe someone we want to keep around. So we'll kind of see how it all shakes out. But my feeling is it's going to end up being a little bit of each when it all, the dust settles.
Yeah. Kind of going on to coaching a little bit extra. I want to talk a little bit just to kind of finish off about the Monsters, who obviously had a great season, ran into the powerhouse Hershey Bears in the Eastern Conference Final, and almost did the dang thing. Trent Vogelhuber, I think, has done a fantastic job down in Cleveland. Do you see, where do you see him as kind of an option for? Do you think the Blue Jackets see him as an option down the line? Are they just kind of seeing where he goes from here? How excited do you think the organization is about having a guy like Vogelhuber kind of in, not necessarily in that back pocket, but kind of a guy that's kind of developing and could potentially be a part of the Blue Jackets coaching staff kind of somewhere down the road?
Yeah, I would not be surprised at all. And I'm sure they're thrilled to have him in this organization. The job that they did down in Cleveland this year, and you could see the results on the ice. But just being around that team during the playoff run and a couple times during the season when I went up there to do some interviews, you could really sense how close that team was. And there isn't a magic elixir for that. Probably not. It's probably a mix of some of the things that the coaching staff did. And it's also a mix of just the group of guys that you have. And they were in a situation, too, where a lot of those guys, the Jet Greaves, the Trey Fix-Wolanskis, even like a Brendan Gaunce, a Carson Meyer, a Jake Christensen, a lot of those guys have played 3 or 4, in some cases 5 years of hockey together in Cleveland. And so they really built a bond over a certain amount of time and a lot of good guys, too. I mean, guys that you really enjoy being around. I mean, Jet and Fix and, some of those guys are all just really good guys. So, I think it was probably a combination of both, just the mix of players that they had, but also the job the coaching staff did to really, keep that bond going and really strengthen that bond. So, he did an unbelievable job down there. For them to almost beat Hershey was really impressive. Hershey's is kind of a juggernaut down there. They've won 2 in a row. An older team as well that has probably more experience than the Monsters had, and they stood there toe-to-toe with them and gave them everything that they could give them. So really tremendous job done by Trent Vogelhuber and his staff. And I don't think you could argue this guy's a rising star in the coaching world. And getting to know Vogues a little bit too, you can see why. When I talked about the leadership presence of a Dean Evason, I think Vogues has that as well, where the way he carries himself and the way he treats people, it commands a lot of respect out of players. And so someone who I think is very much in the plans down the road because of that. And he's still 35 or 30. I think he's younger than me, which is terrifying to think about. But still, some growth there and someone that, it's perfectly fine for someone that age to be in your organization and coaching in the AHL level and getting a chance to really, build those coaching chops and someone that's, I think, going to be an NHL head coach down the line. And, we'll see where it goes from here. Will that be in Columbus next? Who's to say? But certainly someone I think is going to be a really good coach down the road.
Yeah, for sure. I covered the AHL All-Star game in San Jose in February. Got to talk to Trent Vogel, who were a little bit there, and you do kind of get the feeling talking to him. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I probably would run through a wall if this guy asked me to. So like, you kind of, the way that he talks is, you forget that he is only 35, 36. It feels like he's been coaching for a lot longer. So this podcast is a huge Trent Vogelhuber fan. We are rooting for him to find success. Hopefully find success with the Blue Jackets organization, but just if not, general success everywhere. I have kept you for longer than I meant to, so I want to finish off with one last question.
I talk too much. It's me. It's not you.
I think it's probably a little bit of both of us. I'm really bad at asking questions, and you love to give really thorough answers, which is great content for the podcast. So I'll allow it. But what's the expectation for this team this season?
To be better. How much better will remain to be seen, but at some point you've got to start winning games. And you've got a team now, there's not Cole Sillinger as an 18-year-old rookie. There's Cole Sillinger 4 years into his NHL career. And I could say that about Kent Johnson and Igor Chinikov and even like Dmitry Voronkov and Adam Fantilli's in the second year. You're starting to see these guys grow and get older. And so at some point they go from precocious youngsters figuring out the league to guys that are key parts of the lineup and key cogs and guys you can depend on consistently on a night-to-night basis. And I think we've seen a lot of those young players really take strides in that way. But when are those guys going to pop to where they're the full versions of themselves? With some of these guys, like, would I be stunned if Igor Chinikov scores 30 or 40 goals this upcoming season? I would not. Would I be surprised if Cole Sillinger takes that offensive jump forward? I would not. Would I be surprised if Adam Fantilli does the same, because now that he has some experience under his belt? And even Ken Johnson, I think I talked about sophomore slumps earlier. That's a guy that probably had one this past season, but if he stays healthy and is able to improve his game, I don't exactly. In fact, that's when he signs, he's someone I want to get in touch with and kind of see how his offseason's going, because he's a huge part of this whole thing. And so as these young guys get experience and they're not just in their first or second year, they're in their third and fourth years, they're going to be better players, and certainly by their fifth or sixth year. But, when does that mix kind of come together? Is the big question for this organization. I think as you look around the league and you look at the teams that are kind of gone young and are in rebuild modes, the lesson is it always takes a little bit longer than you think. I mean, you look at the Devils, they had one really good year, but then, missed the playoffs this past year. People have been waiting for it to happen in Buffalo and Ottawa and some of these places. And it's hard. It's a hard league. I mean, you look at the teams that made it, and, you look at, the veteran nature of those rosters, and even a team, I know the Pittsburgh Penguins were certainly not, the most well-constructed team this past year, but, you still had Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and, guys on that team that won Stanley Cups and stuff, and they didn't even make the playoffs. So, it's a hard league to really start making your way up the standings, but they have to be better. You can't keep being in this situation where you get to November and it feels like the season's over. And it's been that way 2 years in a row. And so you have to start making progress up that road here at some point. And I think that's the goal for this season, is to really start, making sure that that culture that Dean Evason wants to be in place is being put in place, and the structure and the accountability, and start winning more games. You don't have to be a playoff team. Certainly it would be great. We would all be ecstatic if that was the case, but you have to start making steps in the win-loss column this upcoming season and feel like you're making progress toward where you want to get to for this season to be a success.
Yeah, I think my kind of personal, it's weird to say my personal goal, because I have no input on what the team does or how they do or anything, but like, I would love to see somewhere between lottery pick and playoff team, finishing like somewhere between 10th and 16th in the draft order. I think I'd be over the moon with that. Maybe something like what the Red Wings did this year, where they just missed out. I think that's kind of my ideal hope for the Blue Jackets. I'm tired of doing as much draft prep as I do every year.
Yes, I think we'd all agree. So yeah, you just have to start making those steps. I mean, everything, again, they really went young 3 years ago, and that team was probably better than people thought they were going to be the first year of Brad Larsen's tenure. And then, you had a season 2 years ago where the wheels just fell off, and a lot of that was because of injury. I mean, you lose Zach Werenski and you lose all the players they lost early in that season, and it was like, oh boy, and then, this past season, probably you would have liked to have seen a bigger rebound. But again, I think you started to see steps with those younger players. I mean, I think Chinikov played really well. Voronkov came over and was pretty much as advertised. Adam Fantilli, again, he's only 19, but he looked like an NHL player. So, as these guys really get that experience, you're going to start seeing the steps coming. So I think if the young players keep getting better and showing that they can be as good as we think they're going to be, it's going to translate in the win-loss column, but it's going to make you feel pretty excited about the future of this organization as well. So that's where they got to get to, is where you start moving up the standings a little bit this past season. Because if you're drafting top 5 again next year, it's not going to be a good situation.
No. The fans will only give them so much grace. If people want to, I assume that everyone who listens to this podcast already follows you on Twitter and everything, but if people don't, where can they find you and your work online if they want more Blue Jacket content in their lives?
Yes, the written stories are at bluejackets.com, Twitter or X, Jackets Insider. And I'm trying to push the Instagram more this year. So if you're on Instagram, follow me as Jackets Insider on there as well. Trying to show some of the behind the scenes stuff and do some more fun content there. So hopefully I do that and people enjoy it, and you can follow me there.
Well, thanks for coming to chat Blue Jackets for, I think this is the 4th year in a row that you've kind of hopped on for the off season, and I always appreciate it. Always a great time chatting to you, Jef.
Yep. Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
And that's all I've got for you today. We will be back Monday with another episode, and we'll be talking about contract stuff because Koromachenko remains unsigned. So that's going to be a big topic, and we'll take a look at where things are headed with Sillinger and Johnson as well. Lots of moving parts still, but I feel confident that something will get sorted out this weekend with at least one of them. So that's what we'll talk about on Monday. I've been Jef Foster. You can find me on Twitter at _Jacob Foster, JAKOBFORSTER. You can find the show at LO_Blue Jackets on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want to email me, thoughts, comments, questions, criticisms, anything like that, you can email me at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening, for making us your first listen of the day. Locked on Blue Jackets continues to be free and available on all podcast platforms, over on YouTube and on SiriusXM. Once again, we'll be back with you on Monday for a brand new episode of Locked on Blue Jackets. But until then, make sure you stay locked on.